Okay, hello, and welcome to this online presentation of Painfulness and Kripke's Modal Argument. This is a rehearsal of a talk that I'm preparing to give coming up here very quickly in Omaha, Nebraska, at a conference devoted to the work of Saul Kripke in celebration of his recently publishing a collection of his essays, Philosophical Trouble. So this is going to be a very exciting conference. A lot of great speakers. Kripke himself is going to be there giving a talk on Church's thesis as a corollary of Gödel's completeness theorem. I think that's what it is. I'm very much looking forward to that. So I want to go ahead and get started here. Now, Kripke's argument against the identity theory is at this point well known. The basic idea is that identities, when true, are necessarily true, and that what look like contingent identities are really explained away. So take lightning and electrical discharge. It seems to us that we can imagine a case where lightning is something other than electrical discharge. This certainly seems like that's a possibility that, we discovered that electricity wasn't the basis of the phenomenon, which appeared that way. And so the identity between lightning and electrical discharge seems contingent. But Kripke argues that what actually turns out to be contingent is the appearance that lightning presents to us. So what's really conceivable, he claims, is that there be some other phenomenon which is not electrical discharge, but which presents to creatures in that possible world the same appearance that lightning presents to us. But that, he goes on to argue, isn't an example of lightning being other than electrical discharge. It's something else which just has this same accidental property. So it just looks like lightning does. As Kripke puts it, those people would be in the same epistemic situation we are when we're actually seeing lightning, but they wouldn't be seeing lightning. Now, in the case of mind-brain identities, and in consciousness in particular, he poses a problem. That now, it certainly seems like these identities are contingent in just the same way that lightning and electrical discharge is. And so it certainly seems prima facie possible that pain be other than a brain state. And yet it doesn't seem like we can appeal to the same kind of strategy for explaining away the contingency. So these things seem not just to look like they're contingent, but to really be contingent. So I think Kripke makes this point in his strongest possible fashion in a footnote in a paper called Identity and Necessity, which I quote here. So he says, look, it's impossible to explain the apparent possibility of C fiber stimulations not having been pain in the same way that we explained these other kinds of identities away. Because here, too, he says, we would have to suppose that we could have been in the same epistemological situation and identify something in the same way we identify pain without its corresponding to C fiber stimulation. But the way we identify pain is by feeling it, and if a C fiber stimulation could have occurred without our feeling any pain, then the C fiber stimulation would have occurred without there being any pain. So I think that it's clear that Kripke's argument explicitly assumes that we're picking pain out by an essential property, and that is, namely, the property of it feeling a certain way to us when we consciously experience it. Now, this assumption has a strong intuitive appeal, but it's not argued for here. And in fact, in what follows, I'm going to argue that we have good empirical reason to think that it is possible that pain and painfulness comes apart. And if so, then we can explain the appearance of contingency here away in the same way as we do with other scientific identities, and so sort of have a unified account. And so I want to do this by appealing to two phenomenon, dental fear and pain asymbolia, and I think reflecting on these kinds of cases show us how we can explain away the appearance of contingency and still keep these identities as being necessary. Afterwards, once we've cleared away that kind of obstacle, well, then we actually see we're in a position to mount a really powerful argument for physicalism, based on modal considerations. Okay, so then let's go ahead and get started with this and start with dental fear. Now, dental fear is a phenomenon that I first discovered in a class with David Rosenthal when we were reading his book Consciousness and Mind when it was first published. And so I want to consider a quote from his paper where he talks about it. He says, dental patients occasionally report pain when physiological factors make it clear that no pain could occur. And the usual explanation is that fear and the non-painful sensation of vibration cause the patient to confabulate pain. When the patient learns this explanation, what it's like for the patient no longer involves anything painful, but the patient's memory of what it was like before learning the explanation remains unchanged. Even when what it's like results from confabulation, it may be no less vivid and convincing than a non-confabulatory case. So I've always, when I first heard about it, I said, wow, that's really fascinating. So here are some people who think that they say they're in pain, and yet they aren't. Isn't that a case where you have a mental appearance? It appears to you as though you're in pain, and that's distinct from the mental reality. There is no actual pain there. So I thought, well, let me look into this a bit more. Rosenthal doesn't offer any citations here. He just reports this as a phenomenon. And there are people who I know anecdotally who have been in this situation. I haven't been in it myself, so I can't report from my own first-person experience. And it's really difficult to find in the literature cases where this is talked about explicitly. But in searching, I did find one paper from a journal called the British Dental Journal, which seems reputable. I don't know much about dentistry. The paper is called Dental Fear in Children. And the whole paper is talking about, what you do when you find yourself with a patient who's having this kind of reaction. So I think it's informative. So let's go ahead and look at it. They say, problems that a dentist is convinced are associated with misrepresentation of pain may be addressed by explaining the gate theory of pain. A very basic explanation which is suitable for children as young as 5 is as follows. You have lots of different types of telephone wires called nerves going from your mouth to your brain. Some of them carry ouch messages, and the others carry messages about touch and hot and cold. The sleeping potion stops the ouch messages being sent, but not the touch and the hot and cold messages. So you will still know that I am touching the tooth, and you will still feel the cold of the water. Your brain looks out for messages all the time. If you're convinced that it will hurt, it will. This is because if I make the ouch nerves go off to sleep and I touch you, a touch message gets sent. But your brain is looking for ouch messages, and it says to itself, there's a message coming, it must be an ouch message. So you go ouch, and it hurts. Now, they say the language could be adjusted for older children or for philosophers even, but I didn't adjust that. So it seems clear that what's going on here is that they are distinguishing between the pain sensation, the C fiber stimulation as we might call it, and then other kinds of stimulations, what actually turn out to be A fibers and B fibers. Those are the sensations here. And so pain sensations are those mental states via which we sense the tissue damage. In that respect, we're talking about these things just like they're sensations of heat, because pain does turn out to be a way of sensing something or perceiving something, if you like. So the dentist is in effect telling the child that they cannot be having a pain sensation because those nerves are asleep, and so they cannot have any C fiber firing. And the amazing thing is that in most cases this works. So what we have, it looks like, is that we don't have to give them more anesthesia. They say, ow, ow, I'm in pain, ow, ow, and you explain to them that they can't be having a pain sensation, and suddenly there is no more painful sensation. There's no painfulness there, even though they remember before that it was painful. So a patient in a dental fear situation then is picking out the sensation of vibration, which might be carried by an A fiber firing, and they're picking it out in the way that we normally pick out pains. So this seems like it is conceivable that someone could be in the same epistemic position as someone who is in pain, yet not really be in pain. That's what the dental fear situation seems to be bringing out. This person's in the same epistemological situation as someone who is having C fiber firings. You can't distinguish it subjectively, but nonetheless, there are no C fiber firings there. So when we conceive of pain that isn't C fiber firing, I think we might just be conceiving of something like this. And this doesn't seem to pose any kind of problem for the identity theorist. Okay, so now one way you might respond to this is to point out that, look, the Kripkean can sort of move the argument up to the whatever the painful experience is. So maybe it was a mistake to think that it was the sensation. It's whatever it is, because, as Kripke says, quote, for a sensation to be felt as pain is for it to be pain, end quote. So you might say, look, perhaps the dental fear subjects don't correctly identify the sensation of vibration, but if what it is like for them is like experiencing pain, then they must be experiencing pain. So we might just then say, look, let's call P activity, whatever that is, be the neural correlate of whatever's going on in these dental fear patients. That's responsible for it really being the case that they are, in fact, in pain. The Kripkean may go on to say, well, look, the painfulness and the P activity seem contingently related in just the same way as the other things did. So don't we get the same problem over again? So, okay, at that point, what I do is to move to the second case, because I think this is a legitimate concern with the way that we've set up the dental fear case so far. It does seem like, well, why don't we just run the same argument on the painfulness? Well, the reason that this isn't going to work is because pain asympholia suggests something very strange. So first let me talk about what it is, and then I want to try to suggest that this shows us that that pain feeling a certain way is a contingent property of the pain state. So pain asymbolics have a specific kind of brain damage, usually to the insular cortex, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes. And they're able to feel pain, but they don't feel it as unpleasant. So what does it mean to say that they're able to feel pain? Well, they can discriminate between different kinds of pains. So if you poke them with a pin versus burn them, they can tell you which one came from burning and which one came from poking. So they know that they can tell the difference in these kinds of experiences. And in fact, they can tell you how intense the stimulus was. A light burn versus a serious burn, a shallow pinprick versus a deep pinprick. So altogether, even though they're able to do this, and all along, they don't seem to regard this as a bad thing. They're not motivated to withdraw. They don't find they say, yes, it's a pain. Yes, I see. It's a pricking pain or a burning pain. I can tell it's an intense pain, an intense burning, but it doesn't seem to bother them. They don't experience it as being painful. So now this is very strange, and so to make this vivid, I want to quote the following study, this is from a study of a pain asymbolic, and this study itself is widely reported and talked about in the pain literature. So this is kind of a classic pain asymbolia study. And so what they say is, and they're talking about a specific patient, they say in spite of apparently normal pain perception of superficial and deep pain, the patient showed a total lack of withdrawal response. He tolerated prolonged pinprick or soft tissue pinching in all four limbs without adequate grimacing or defensive movement of his limbs. Such abnormal findings were constantly recorded throughout the daily evaluations of pain. On occasion, the patient willingly offered his hand for pain testing and laughed during stimulation. So this is kind of a very strange phenomenon we're talking about. Notice that what they're doing to this guy is coming around periodically and pinching him, poking him with pins, and then asking him to rate how intense it was or what kind of pain it was in the soft tissue of his arm and his legs. And this guy is willingly offering his hand to be pricked or pinched, and is laughing while they're doing it. And they don't know why he's laughing, so they hypothesize maybe it's to make them feel more at ease. So we seem to have a very strange phenomenon on our hand. So let's sum up what's going on in pain asymbolia. So the first thing we can point out is that these people are having conscious experience of pains. They are reporting to us what kind of pains that they are. We have very good evidence that they're picking out these states by the mental properties. So they're picking it out as a pain, and they're picking it out as a specific kind of pain. Now, we normally pick out pains by the way that it feels to us, as feeling awful, like what's going on in the dental fear case. We pick out pains by that feeling, which we associate with it. But yet in this case, that seems absent. They're not picking it out in terms of it's feeling a certain way to them. They're picking out according to some other properties. And so this suggests, I think, the following view. We have the term conscious experience of pain, and we fix the reference of that by this contingent property that pain has, which is that it appears to us in a certain way as being awful and terrible. So that the painfulness of pain, the awfulness of a conscious pain, is a contingent property. You might put it this way: that is the way the pain state appears to us in normal conditions. But as pain asymbolia shows, it could appear differently and still be a pain. All right, so now how we put all these pieces of the puzzle together. So here's Kripke. He says, if X is a pain and Y the corresponding brain state, then being a pain is an essential property of X, and being a brain state is an essential property of Y. And he goes on to say, it seems clearly possible that X should have existed without the corresponding brain state, or that the brain state should have existed without being felt as a pain. So if we take this, if X is the pain and Y is the brain state, and we're saying that these two things really are identical, then Kripke is here saying, look, it certainly seems possible that these could have existed independently of each other. So X could have been identical to something else, Z, whatever it is, and Y could have been identical to something else, maybe, V, so the pain could have been a non-physical state, maybe that's what Z is, or the brain state could have been something else, maybe that's, a motor function in some animal or whatever. And so now clearly that's impossible. If the identity is true, then this has to be ruled out in some way, and that can't be what's going on when we think we can conceive of this. Notice that's exactly what we did in the case of lightning and electrical discharge. We said it certainly seems like we're imagining this thing could have been something else, but actually we explained that away by showing how what we thought we were imagining was not what we were in fact imagining. So how do we do that here? Well, what the basic idea, what the view is presenting suggests, is that if painfulness is a contingent property of pains, then there could be other things which exhibit those same kind of appearances. So when Kripke says it is clearly possible that X should have existed without the corresponding brain state, we can accommodate something like that. We say, no, really, when you're imagining the pain without the brain state, what you're really imagining is that some other state, say this non-physical state, some other thing presents the same kind of appearances. It has this contingent property of appearing painful to the subject. Now, of course, they aren't really in pain. That's what we would call fool's pain. They aren't really in pain because pain is identical to a brain state, and they aren't in that brain state. So they are just in some state which appears in the way that pain does to us. That sounds funny, but we've seen that in the dental fear case, these people are picking out some other kind of state. But it still presents the same kind of appearance. Now, what about the other case when he says the brain state could have existed without being felt as a pain? No, if you're sort of imagining that brain state existing but not being felt as a pain, it still is a pain. It's a pain because that's what it is. That's what the thing itself is. There's not the pain in the brain state. There's just the brain state, which is a pain. So if you're conceiving of it, then it is a pain. I mean, given that the laws work the way they do, if you invent some crazy laws, then all bets are off. But in a world like ours, it is a pain. It just lacks the appearance of painfulness. So there's nothing odd with saying that you have that thing there, but it's not exhibiting the awfulness of pain. That's what's going on in the pain asymbolia cases. So to sum up then, it is true that in all possible worlds that a pain is a pain, but it is not true in all possible worlds that pain is felt as painful. And this dissolves the force of Kripke's argument. The identity in question is necessary, and when we think we imagine otherwise, we in fact end up imagining someone who would be in the same epistemic situation that we are in when we pick out P activity, which is what pains are, but they would not be in pain because they don't have that kind of activity. To the extent that this seems confounding is exactly the extent to which one is implicitly assuming that pain and painfulness necessarily go together. So if this is true, then why do people seem like so committed to the view that the awfulness of pain is an essential property of it? And I think that something that Kripke says in a different context can actually help us make sense of this. So here's a quote from, this is from Naming and Necessity. And in this quote, what he's talking about is this question that you might have. All right, so imagine a world where imagine a world where there are creatures that have conscious experiences like we do. They see red and yellow and so forth, and hear sounds and etc. But imagine that their experience of red is not caused by light hitting the eye, but something else, mean molecular kinetic energy, so what we would normally call heat. So now here's a world where there's something else which is causing this experience. And Kripke wonders, look, is this a world where light is heat? Where heat is light, I'm sorry? Is this a world where heat is light? And he says, no. In fact, that's just, again, a world where something else is presenting the same kind of, causing the same kind of appearances. So someone in that world would be in the same epistemic situation that we are when we are picking out light, but they would be picking out what we would call heat. And so they aren't picking out light. And he says, well, this can be confusing because the fact that we identify light in a certain way seems to be crucial, even though it is not necessary. The intimate connection may create the illusion of necessity. And I think that's what's going on here. Even if you think there's this crucial thing going on with light, then in the case of pain and other conscious experiences is exactly the same. We think that there's some kind of really tight connection between the way that thing appears to us and the way that it really is. But systematically, what we've been discovering is that that's not true. The way our mental life appears to us is not the same in all instances as the way that it really is. So the fact that what it is like for us to experience conscious pain is as painful is arguably a contingent feature of the sensation of pain, and as suggested by these things. And it seems like, okay, this crucial connection then generates this illusion. What we need, at the very least, is some kind of argument suggesting that there's more than just this illusion of necessity, that these two things must always go together. Okay, so that's basically my presentation of how I think a physicalist should respond to Kripke's modal argument. So you assume that pain is identical to a brain state, and you show that that assumption doesn't lead to any contradictions. And in fact, what I think really is that we can see these kinds of weird symptoms, like pain, asymbolia, and dental fear, as predictions that the physicalist position makes. So if it really is true that these identities are necessary, and it really is true that pain just is a brain state, then it's got to be the case that you explain the contingency of these identities away by appealing to the distinction between the way pain appears to us and the way that it actually is. So a lot of people have found this to be very strange and have tinkered with the theory to try to avoid it, whereas I'm suggesting the theory all by itself predicts it, and then in fact empirically we've been able to confirm it. And what this does then is it shows us how we could construct a modal argument for physicalism. Because all this whole time what we've been doing is conceiving of the, we've been playing with the possibility that these identities are true. So we've been conceiving that they're true. It seems possible that they're true. We haven't found any contradictions in their being true. And so I've called these kind of creatures in other works shambis. A shambi is just a physical duplicate of me, and it has consciousness and no other non-physical properties. So that certainly seems conceivable. We've been talking about a creature something like a shambi this whole time. And importantly, I think that whether or not I know how consciousness could be physical is irrelevant to my being able to entertain the possibility that it is physical. I think a helpful analogy here is with an unknowable truth. So if you say to yourself, can I imagine that there is some truth that is not knowable by anyone? Well, of course, it seems like you can. I certainly think I can imagine a possible world in which there is an unknowable truth. This world we live in here may even be such a world. Now, obviously, in so conceiving, I am not knowing which truth it is I'm conceiving of. That would make it a knowable truth. So if it really is unknowable, then it's got to remain unknown in the process of conceiving it. So the moral of this, I think, is pretty simple. Is that knowing what something is or how it works is one thing, and conceiving that it could be true is another thing. So all we're doing here is invoking the conceivability that these identities are true. So when we say that all there is in the Shambi world is our physics, what we mean is that everything that exists there is identical to some physical property or conjunction of properties. The resulting physical property may be very large and complex, but there is some physical property that just is the thing in question. So how do you conceive of such a world? Well, you start by conceiving of a world that consists merely in the instantiation of our physics. So here's a little picture summarizing what the standard model of particle physics and their interactions look like. So you conceive a world where there is just that stuff. Now, we want to make sure to rule out any kind of non-physical entities in our Shambi world. We don't want consciousness to be non-physical there. So we have to add something to this stipulation. We have to add a that's all clause. So let's formalize this a little bit. And I'm going to follow Chalmers here. We'll define P as a conjunction of all microphysical truths about the universe, specifying the fundamental features of every fundamental microphysical entity in the language of microphysics. That's the way Chalmers puts it, and I'm following him. And then we'll use T to stand for that's all. And so we could have the conjunction PT, which is just this conjunction of P from above, with a nothing else clause. Now, how do you do that? How do you write out T here? Now, there are various ways to do this, and I have a way that I think is intuitive, and it basically captures the reasoning that I gave just a second ago. So I call it PT sub E, and it's here on the screen. So P here is just our complex conjunction of all the microphysical truths specified in terms of fundamental microphysical entities and the way that they interact in the language of particle physics, so whatever that turns out to be. And over here, there exists an x such as x equals y as an existence predicate. And so what this really says is what you have in this world is all the truths of our physics, and everything that exists there, there's some physical property which it's identical to. So if electrons exist there, there's some physical property that they exist as identical to, and we can check our table of particles and find out that in fact the electrons do exist according to this. And then of course you get conjunctions of these properties, and so tables and chairs and so forth, if they exist, then they'll be identical to some conjunction of physical properties, and so forth and so on. So now, suppose that I'm one of the things that exists in this world, then we know that there are some subset and arrangement of physical properties which I am identical to. And since I'm stipulated to have consciousness, by the way, this was me in the winter when I was experimentally growing out my beard, and so we know now that there's going to be some physical set of properties there that just is me. And since we know that this identity is true, we can conclude that it's necessarily true. And so therefore that dualism is true. Excuse me. And so therefore that dualism is false. Okay, so let me just make clear that sometimes people interpret this argument the following way. So they go, oh, I know what you're doing. You're saying, look, it certainly is, possible that this thing is necessarily true. And if it's possible that it's necessary, right, then it's by this modal axiom S5, if you like that sort of thing, you can derive that it's necessarily true. Now, I think that this is a bad way of arguing. To conceive of a Shambi is just to conceive of a world where consciousness is physical. You don't have to conceive that it's necessarily so. And I think that this can be demonstrated by looking at the argument which is used to establish that identities are necessary. So here, the first premise says that if any two things are identical, then if one has the property, so does the other. The second premise says that all objects are necessarily self-identical, and that seems okay. And the third premise is a substitution instance of the first. So what that says, the first premise says, look, if they're identical, then if one has a property, then the other has a property. And sentence 3 there says, well, look, if they're identical, then if one is necessarily self-identical, then it's necessary that the other one is identical to it. Now, what do we make of this? And then so you conclude that if they're identical, then it's necessary that they're identical. So look at premise 2 here. It states that the self-identity is necessary. Every object is necessarily self-identical. Now, you could dispute that premise. In fact, some Lewisians who believe in modal realism would dispute that, since counterparts are not, strictly speaking, identical to you. They're just distinct creatures which maximally resemble you in some respects. So they're described purely qualitatively. You're not allowed to have an essence or anything in there, so you don't get the identity across possible worlds. Or you just might be a hardcore Quinian, and you may deny that the box has any truth makers, or to put that differently, that there's any way for us to reliably determine the truth of these kinds of things, which isn't question begging. So someone might say, look, you think you can't imagine pairs that falsify this, but that's because you already assume that it's true. So that's a kind of argument which some people who might attribute to Aquinians. And I'm not suggesting that I accept either of those arguments. What I'm suggesting is that it's a substantial philosophical thesis that identities are necessary. Maybe it's a priori in principle if you accept premise 2 here, but the conclusion here tells us what we need to know. if the things are identical, then they're necessarily identical. And so them being identical is not the same as it's being necessary. And so really how the argument for physicalism goes is we just start by conceiving that P is identical to Q, or that, the mind is physical, where P is the physical stuff and Q is the consciousness stuff. So we don't take an issue on whether identities are necessary. Now then, maybe if you're convinced by this argument on the left here, and I'd be inclined to accept premise 2, then we can employ the conclusion of this argument. Okay, if P is identical to Q, then it's necessary that P is identical to Q. And that's what gives us the truth of physicalism. If it's necessary that the mind is the brain, then the mind is the brain here in our actual world. So the argument for physicalism does depend on invoking the necessity here, but it doesn't do so by telling you to conceive that it's necessarily true. I don't even know what that means, how you would conceive of it being true in all possible worlds. Rather, you just conceive of it as being true in one world and use an argument to show that if it's true in one world, then it's true in all possible worlds. And so the modal argument for physicalism begins by invoking just that conceivability, just to conceive the identity. And to imagine that it's identical to the brain, it's simply to invoke PT sub E, which I mentioned earlier, and this premise up here. So it just tells you that if they're the same, then when one has a property, the other has the property as well. Okay, so I suggest then, taken all together, that these modal considerations, this argument is very powerful, and when it's updated with relevant empirical data like dental fear and pain asymbolia, what we get is a favor towards physicalism. So I think this is actually a much more powerful argument than the argument against physicalism. All right, I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to any discussion. Thank you very much.